first step was to kind of try and reflect on what we saw here, and Molly can have her reflections. I guess my reflection is people paid attention to the talks, or you believed us or agreed with us or something. So I think we saw a lot on this one. Clearly, I think, you know, the unfortunate sort of aspect is when bad things happen, they happen to poor people and they're less able to adapt to it. So, you know, this is a kind of not too hard of a question. We see a lot of poor and then I think Molly made a very good point that we see a lot of hunger in subsistence agriculture. Oddly enough, people who are actually growing food are the ones that end up hungry. So I think that's interesting. And then here, I think my reflection is just, you know, it's going to take everyone, and so I think everything got some votes. But I think what I see here is a lot of focus on regional collaboration, nations, and international. And so this is going to take some collaboration, both certainly on the mitigation side, but also on issues like, you know, making sure people are food secure. That just takes some collaboration to go ahead. So that's my thought. I think hopefully good, fun answer.
I think that was a great response. On the first slide, I think I would just point out that a lot of the small-scale farmers are also poor consumers. They're not raising all of their own food. They're trying to buy some of their food, but they're not making enough money to buy all the food that they need. So those two groups that got the most votes have a lot of overlap. And then on the second one, I would agree completely that it's going to take all of these groups working together to find solutions and to implement solutions. And I'm pleased actually to see that national governments acting unilaterally got relatively few votes, because it's all going to be about collaboration and figuring out ways that we can get people to work together more effectively than they've been working together recently.
All right, thanks for those reflections. Now I want to turn it over to you for any additional questions or comments you would have, so we can have a discussion here with our panelists. So please.
The comment about governments working together and multiple governments working together, is that based on what you think is conceptually best or what you think is realistically possible?
I would say conceptually best. The success rate. Yeah, the success rate so far, it's been just dismal. How, and I have to say, as a U.S. citizen, I am not real pleased with the role that my country has been playing in international negotiations on reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
I mean, the food security issue is obviously something that nations need to take on to some degree themselves. I think Molly emphasized in her points that you have countries that are too poor to maybe do it themselves. It would be nice to imagine that there could be some collective action towards that. Unfortunately, the history of that is not good at all, and there is a variety of issues and problems. I mean, aid can be, a lot of our approaches to aid have been, you know, undermining of individual action. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I think on the greenhouse gas control there, obviously if we just do this ourselves, we're not going to get anywhere. We need collective action. I think on some of these broader food issues, we have issues of, you know, in the last food price run-up, you know, some countries that produce food put export controls on, and that increased the spike in food prices. So you have other things like that happening where some coordination is certainly needed.
Although some of that I think is because food reserves have been decimated. And some of that was because of structural adjustment programs in which, in part of the terms of getting international loans were to get rid of reserves, food reserves. So if a country has adequate reserves, then that means that it has the wherewithal to take care of its people. It's really hard to expect a country to continue exporting food if its own people are hungry and they're protesting in the streets because they don't have enough food. So I think we have to recognize that that we've got to be setting up reserves that are accessible to countries to use in times of crisis.
Would you both take the mics out of the stand and hold it? I don't think that it's coming out very well. Just pull it straight out.
Thank you guys, first of all, for your speeches. One question I had, particularly about some of the graphs about production. Do they really take into account a shift in the way that we produce food? So instead of the agricultural model or the industrial model that is kind of the prevalent model today, do those decreases in food production and the effects faced by climate change take into account maybe a shift in the way that we view in practice as a whole the production of our food crops?
Well, to some degree, but not nearly as well as you might like. I think I was, as Molly was beginning to criticize the IPCC third assessment report, I was just sitting there with my fist clenched, hoping she didn't go back to the second assessment report, because I was conveniently to author the agriculture sector on that. But fortunately, she stuck with the third assessment report, and I actually, having done this modeling myself, and that's a lot of, we know how inadequate it really is. We're trying to kind of put numbers on these to kind of quantify some of these things, but it really is quite inadequate. And I actually reviewed the third assessment report and objected strenuously to the question, to the comment that Molly had put up on there, saying we just don't know enough. So, our projections are simply, we are kind of seeing agriculture move around, but we're just really looking at crops. We really can't take into account pest and disease things very well, so that's still not embodied in it. We try to represent the climate variability, but the climate models are only so good. And then it's very hard to represent in great detail these different agricultural practices and how we might adapt. We are imagining that we would maybe use more water or more fertilizer, but kind of dramatically changing the practices is hard to represent in these models at the level we're trying to do them. You can do other sorts of things, but you really do run up against, computational limits, but that's the challenge of trying to do better.
I think that's a major research area in the near future. There was a good article by Sonia Vermeulen and Bruce Campbell and John Ingram. Bruce Campbell is the lead of the Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security Program of CJAR, and John Ingram is part of the Global Environmental Institute at Oxford University. It was a paper that was published in 2012 in the Annual Review of Environment and Resources on food systems and climate change. And in the annual reviews, they put summary points at the end, and then they're asked to suggest what are the research questions that your review raises that people need to be considering in the future. And one of the research questions that they said was comparing different agricultural systems. What are the differences and impacts on climate change? And it really hasn't been done. Even for livestock production, that was one of the big complaints about a study that was done called Livestock's Long Shadow by the Food and Agriculture Organization, that was very critical of livestock because of its contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of people were saying, well, what about grass-fed livestock? And what about ways of raising livestock that pastoralists are using, traditional people are using? It doesn't all have to be in confined animal feeding operations and by industrialized agriculture. So you're raising a great question, and I think that's where research needs to go over the next few years, trying to identify what are the practices that will really lead to the best overall impacts.
And I mean, there are claims that highly diversified agriculture can be very productive. There's some studies that show that. On the other hand, we've kind of migrated to the approach we have because it is very productive and it's very, it seems to be economic. So I think the evidence is very hard to sort out about whether if you take a small farm, managed very well, and diversified way in a particular place, maybe do very well, how good would we be at reproducing that over the whole world, and could you feed the whole planet that way? You know, how much of the planet do we have to feed? You know, if we have less people, then we have to feed as much of the planet. So it's really hard to kind of sort out which of these are better. If you just say, well, we aren't going to have biotechnology, we're not going to have chemicals, we're not going to have, fertilizer. Is it really possible to work like that? I'm not sure. I think we have, as Maya was saying, we just haven't done the experiments to really test those hypotheses very carefully.
Some people raise the question, can sustainable agriculture really feed the world? But I like to turn that around and say, can unsustainable agriculture feed the world? Is it practical to think that we can continue with business as usual, given its heavy, heavy reliance on fossil fuels, and think that we're going to continue producing and continue to have high productivity in that kind of system? So it's an open question of how we make that transition to more sustainable practices, but it seems pretty clear that something's got to shift. The global food system is not serving people now with close to 1 billion people who are in really dire food insecurity, and all the environmental problems that the global food system is causing.
One of the, I serve on this advisory food panel for Varela Food and Nutrition Center, and one of the kind of interesting things that's come out of that is that, one of the arguments is that food is too cheap, which is kind of odd in a world in which we have hungry people. But we've really specialized in producing very cheap food, and if we're going to do it with other energy intensive, it may have to be more expensive. But then, at the same time, then maybe rich consumers would eat a little bit more carefully, but that just emphasizes this need to create the income or accessibility for poor consumers to afford good, expensive food. We have this very odd problem in the world today of both malnutrition and obesity, sometimes affecting the very same people. So we have malnourishment in young children who then, as they get older, have an eating disorder, and they eat fats and sugars, and they are obese, but they're stunted. They're physically stunted, mentally stunted, but become obese. So it's the most bizarre combination of hunger and obesity happening at the same time. So we need this nutritious element of food and better quality food, and I think people need to be able to afford that rather than to produce cheap food that isn't very nutritious, which is kind of a lot of what we do today.
We don't even need questions. We can just keep talking to each other.
I like it, but we do have time for one more question from the audience. Monica, go ahead.
Monica Kumura, PhD student at Northeastern. So giant companies like Kraft Foods, Sad Miller, and Unilever have started to embrace this triple win model of mitigation of climate change, adaptation, and poverty reduction. What's the level of confidence that you have in other companies joining their lead? And by the way, I just read Sonia Bernoulli's article, and I used it for my literature review. It was very interesting.
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question, please.
So, giant companies like Kraft Foods, Sad Miller, and Unilever are embracing a triple win model of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and poverty reduction. What's the level of confidence that you have on other companies joining their lead?
Level of confidence. The companies have been working together for some time. I'm aware of several efforts, sustainability efforts, in which Big Food, the biggest food companies, are working together. One is run by a friend, Sustainable Food Lab up in Vermont, and Unilever is a close partner of that. They were one of the first agribusinesses to join Sustainable Food Lab. And I think that other companies will buy in Sustainable Food Lab has been growing rapidly. The question to me is, how much impact will their actions really have, especially when it comes to the issue of social sustainability? I think for environmental sustainability, it's relatively easy for agribusinesses to see that they will be hurt if natural resources are degraded, because their bottom line depends on having clean water and good soil. But when it comes to social sustainability and paying workers a lot more, then I think that's a bit more delicate. That's where push comes to shove. And I'm not sure that we'll see strong impacts there.
Yeah, the industry is conflicted, right? So it makes a lot of money on some of these things. I mean, the meat story is one of the biggest challenges. I think there are some, the way we grow beef is very resource intensive, very greenhouse gas intensive, but the meat industry, I think, doesn't want to admit that. So I think that's a challenge. I think, we work with some industries that are thinking about this and some companies are trying to think about this a bit, and I think there is an interest. Both the energy companies and the agricultural companies are responding to some degree to what consumers are demanding and reacting to the pricing we have in the system. And the income levels of people. If we don't correct people's income levels so they can afford good food, and we don't have a pricing system that reflects the fact that greenhouse gases are damaging the environment, then we go to fossil fuels and poor calorie, low foods. If we price things correctly, then industry can respond. But with that, there's, I think, a limited amount they'll actually be able to do.
All right, many thanks again to our speakers and to you for all your questions. What if we had a silver bullet? What if we could just adjust what's happening out there in the atmosphere and protect us from some of the undesirable consequences of climate change? What about geoengineering as a solution? Very scary thoughts. Some say great promise. We have two speakers next week who will address this issue, both from a technological as well as from an international security perspective. Armand Cohen, he's the co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force and the co-founder of the Conservation Law Foundation Energy Project. We'll be here, and John Steinbrenner, a longtime friend and colleague of mine at the University of Maryland, who's an international security specialist, who asks questions that go back to questions that General Titley asked as well. Admiral Titley, when he was here, talked about security issues surrounding climate change. It's not just rising sea levels, but it's also the fact that if we begin to mess with the climate system in a very strategic way, who bears the consequences? Who's reliable? Do we have treaties to deal with this? John will address some of that as well. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week.